Yeah, so I think the whole contextual conversation is super interesting because if you as you sort of were alluded to, it's this idea of where context was and where it's gone. So I think for those of us who have been around for a while, the idea that I'm selling a running shoe and so I'm going to promote content on Runner's World or Runner's Magazine, that made sense. And if you think back to the history of television, very similar, right? There's a product I have that's an audience would be interested in, and that's where I would advertise. And I think that worked until we got all these great advancements in our marketplace with targeting and with data. I think now as we see sort of the tide turning and all of these things all these things sort of taking shape, whether it's cookie deprecation or app tracking, I think now becomes this time in which there's a shift to where context gets its place back in the spotlight, because first and foremost, the idea that I'm on a running site and therefore I'm interested in some way, shape, or form about running, it is still true. I think sometimes we try to push away content because we were so focused on targeting individuals at that cookie level and targeting them anywhere. And I do think the construct of reading a piece of content that you're interested in and then seeing a product that's related to that content does still hold true in the way consumers look at products. I think the other thing that, and I think a big thing for people to think about, and it's specific to some things we're doing at PhD on this, is around like how you use the data sets that you have, how we curate certain inventory or certain identity graphs to figure out, where do you put those two blends together? So if it's going back to my running example, it's not just the running, the sneaker on the running site, it's a sneaker on the running site, but it's also using other privacy, compliant data that gets us a little bit closer to that target audience so that we can maybe get someone who's further along in the journey.
So, Josh, not to get too deep in the weeds, but what are those signals and how do you process them and how do you optimize your planning?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways. I think first and foremost, there's a whole lot of conversation just around what data either you have in your first party set or until cookies do go away, what's there. So it could be anything from location to demographic information to query based information, whether there was something in your search histories. I do think also there's just segments that you see that are still openly available, whether it's products purchased or tangential products purchased. So if you bought a home in the last 6 months, maybe you're in the market for a kitchen remodel. Those kinds of signals, I think, are still very telling. And there's still plenty of them out there that can be gained in a way that still complies with all the privacy restrictions that are there.
Now, you've been on the client side, on the brand side for a number of years, joining PhD fairly recently. When you kind of look at the landscape quite recently in terms of your work on the marketer side, what is it that marketers are looking for, do you think, in terms of contextual advertising, and how do they see it? And maybe you could reflect on some of your experiences.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because in some ways, I feel as though we've got clients are looking for the outcome that their desired outcome. I guess it's whether it's an acquisition cost or a sales goal or a profit target or a consumption goal. And so I think the mechanism of how you get there made it less about like what were we doing and more about saying, okay, our goal is X, and so here's the pieces we're going to put in place, and contextual could be one of them. And so I think now with the privacy pieces kicking in, I think there's a combination, actually. I think there's a privacy piece that's kicked in, which has now made us all take a closer look at, well, where are we and what are we doing? And how do we make sure, especially I've worked for very big corporations, how do we keep ourselves out of any potential risk? And if we, what are those mechanisms that are out there? And that's when you head down the path of the contextuals with, your premium partners or looking at private marketplaces. I think it gets more of a spotlight because those kinds of questions are being asked. I think also there's a part that I know was missing in some instances from prior lives, which was, this balance between, the short-term efficiency gains that much of programmatic or social or search have given us into this world of managing, I guess, for sort of brand action, which is, I think, the blending of brand performance and actually performance. So it's less about, hey, I drove this really efficient cost per acquisition. What was the impact to your brand equity scores, though? Is this still going to be a product that's going to resonate with a consumer 3 months from now, or did you just hit that person in the most efficient way with the right frequency that it made the purchase happen today? And I think that's the next, or not the next, but I think it's one of the big hills that contextual sort of helps with, because you kind of get the best of both in the sense of you could still be effective, efficient, look at performance, you could also be aligned to content that lines up with your brand values. One of the things that we're very proud of from the PhD side is, we've taken, some real strong looks at the inventory that's out there and trying to figure out, not only forget about inventory that we know needs to be brand safe, but even inventory for content sites that support, poor journalism or misinformation. A lot of consumers these days believe that if you see an ad on a particular site, they don't realize it's not bought the way TV's bought and that you must endorse that site. So I think the thoughtfulness that Contextual takes you down, and what we try to do is look at where those pockets of inventory are and make sure they line up with both a sort of a marketing performance metric, but also a brand value metric.
So speaking about inventory, there's not a lot, but it's very hot, is CTV inventory, and that's changing the equation, certainly, in terms of how TV is bought. How does contextual advertising fit into CTV, and what are the opportunities there?
Yeah, I think so. The interesting thing about CTV, or just TV in general, I kind of alluded to it earlier. I think contextual or TV was maybe the stage one of contextual. Yes, I mean there's some degree of just looking at demo-based buying, but I mean I might be older than I look. But I remember all the Miller Lite commercials, all airing during football, and that was contextual. They were going after a male audience that drank beer, and so football makes total sense. And I think the bones of that are still there in the world of CTV. What I love about what CTV has done for us now is being able to take all that great stuff that you have from your data in terms of learnings about your audience, and then overlay that onto the connected TV piece of your buy. So what we see a lot of the benefit for, and again, this is in prior life of looking at where you see things like reach and frequency management, message managing, how do you manage for waste? I've seen countless analysis across several years that show how many times a user sees a commercial that's over the frequency number that you've wanted, because some of those guardrails aren't always in place in the sort of linear world. And so I think what's great about another great thing about the connected piece is having those things in place so that you can minimize that waste piece and just get really more targeted in terms of that audience. Once again, all in great privacy compliant ways, but the way you manage these things is starting to become, a lot more clearer. And I think contextual has a nice seat here in the TV world, because again, you are looking at shows that speak to a certain type of audience. Now, if I can pick a show that speaks to an audience and I can throw on the top that I'm looking for someone who, bought a home in the last 6 months, well, then even better. And it makes my audience that I'm targeting a little more narrow, but a little more targeted. And I think that's where you get a nice synergy there.